Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I think we are ready to start. So, good morning. I'm Jorge Costa. I'm currently Vice Rector of Research here at Iscte. And I would like to express my welcome all the ambassadors here, the representatives of the embassies, the representatives of the European Commission, dear friends, to this meeting to discuss a very important topic. Myself, I'm an engineer. I'm not from the areas of international relations. So while I was preparing these few words, I was thinking, what should I talk? And I think the best way to express the importance of what we are going to discuss here is to tell you a little bit of a thing that happened to me during this weekend. It's a very short story. And this weekend, I had my father-in-law for dinner during the weekend. And when he left, I went cleaning the kitchen. And I asked my youngest son, 11, to help me bring the dishes to the kitchen while I was cleaning. Since we had the dinner at home, I didn't have the chance to hear the news. And as I usually do, because I like to be updated with the news, I put my mobile phone and recapped the evening news. I put the evening news talking while I was cleaning the kitchen and while my kid was bringing the dishes. And if everyone knows, the opening news during this weekend was the aggression of Iran to Israel. And while I was cleaning the dishes, my kids asked, what happened? Are we going to face another war? And I didn't pay much attention to him. I said, okay, no, probably it's not a big deal. Don't worry. And the news started, okay, they bombed with missiles and other aspects. And then he asked me again, do the range of those equipments are able to reach us? And I said to him, I don't know. I don't have a clue. I'm not a military. And I continued. When I answered to him, I thought to myself, probably I didn't provide the best answer here. I'm facing a problem. And I looked to him and his expression changed. And the third question immediately made me feel that I was in trouble because he asked me, where is Iran? I said, in Middle East. Is it a big country? Do they have a strong military army? Is stronger than us? And I said, okay, I'm definitely in a problem. If I don't answer this correctly, I will have a problem in the night because he'll be full of nightmares and it will be a mess. So what I said, okay, he's in the Middle East. Probably you don't know where the Middle East. I stopped the news. I picked my phone and I showed the map. I went to Google Maps and say, okay, this is the world map. Iran is here. Portugal is here. In fact, Iran is a bigger country than us. Okay, don't problem. But look, you can move from Portugal to Iran, and you can move all the countries that you cross are either our European partners or members of NATO. So even the fact that we are a small country, we have strong allies. And it's in the union of the strong allies that is our best defense, because no one will mess with us because they have to mess with all of our allies at the same time. So don't be worried, I said to him, and I solved the problem. The question that I'll leave to you here to discuss is, it's not actually true that all the countries from here to the Iran border are our European members or our allies. And although I'm not 11 years old, I'm almost 50, how do you solve the question of bringing all those countries into the group? How do you solve the problem of putting all those different opinions working together to the better of all the members? I know that it is in the difficult times, in the difficult periods, that are the best opportunities. And as we face difficult times, as we face the prospect of wars, it's easier to find common grounds to have the different countries to work together. But even with that, we have to face problems that to be in a club of 27 is different to be in a club of 30, 35. How do we change our ways of governing the European bodies with so many different partners, with so many different cultures? I don't know, I'm an engineer. That's why I will stop myself from talking, and I leave the ground to the experts to answer those questions. And definitely, I hope that you answer them well, because I have to go back and to answer my kids a couple of more questions later on, probably. Thank you all.
Muito bom dia a todas e a todos. I'll switch now to English. And I will start with that by thank you all for being here and for saying that it's fantastic that we can have this conversation today in English. Facilitates a lot. First and foremost, I would like to say a big thank you for this great house that is hosting us here. And then with the Vice Chancellors, thank you so much, Iscte, for having us here. Second, would like to say this is a joint adventure. I'm the head of the European Commission representation here in Portugal, and one of our tasks is to stimulate debate, conversation, and dialogue on relevant European issues and make everyone here in Portugal, in all the corners of the territory, to realize this is Europe, this is European Union, and it's here that we make European Union happening. And in this task that we have to communicate and talk about Europe, we work, of course, with very, very closely with all our colleagues from the other member states' embassies. And this is a joint endeavor with the Ambassador Merin from the Austrian embassy, who made it possible to bring today here with us someone that has spent a lot of time working, building, and thinking about Europe. Stefan Lehne is a renowned scholar, but also diplomat, very experienced diplomat. I met and had the great privilege to work in his team when he was the special envoy for the Balkans. So has worked a lot on what is today the issues at stake on enlargement. And so it is a really great privilege that he accepted this challenge. And I think it will be a fantastic discussion that will follow his presentation on a very important and pertinent issue, especially as in a couple of days we are celebrating the 20 years of the biggest enlargement wave that occurred in the European Union, when 10 member states, and we're very privileged to have among us today the ambassadors and colleagues from embassies from these countries, joined the European Union, and thus making the European Union much stronger. So celebrating this enlargement 20 years ago from the 1st of May, and the Danish colleague referred that it happened in Copenhagen when this historical moment is also the moment to think and how do we best get prepared for a new enlargement, how relevant that is enlargement a catalyst for an accelerator for reforms, or just a pretext for the reforms to happen? So it's good questions. And without further ado, I would like to call Stefan Lehne and thank him so much for being here with us today, and wish all a very interesting debate and discussions afterwards.
I think, yes, you have to. I must say it's slightly irritating for me to stand here and look at the picture from my early youth. Maybe I have to look into a different direction now and see how time changes. Okay. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I thank Pia and Christoph for making it possible, and I thank also our hosts here in this wonderful building. Enlargement and reforms is a crucial issue. Particularly, it will be a huge issue in the next 3, 4, 5 years, definitely. But in a way, it's already at the very heart of the European process. Okay, now? Thank you very much. I mean, the difference between a state and the European Union is that a state is a fairly stable construct, basically. It has usually a fixed territory, which rarely ever changes. It usually has a constitution that sometimes is changed, but very slowly. Basically, it's meant for a very, very long time. And the EU from the very beginning was conceived as a process that would change considerably in terms of its policies, in terms of its institutions, and in terms of its size. It was supposed to be from the beginning open to other European states. And I'll start out with a brief sort of historical review of how we got there, where we are at the moment, and then focus on the challenges ahead of us. Now, these are the historical enlargements of the European Union. The EU enlarged itself 7 times, but basically there were 4 waves. The first wave was towards the north, the UK, Ireland, and Denmark. Then to the south in 81 and 86, Greece, Spain, and Portugal. Then again to the north, well, Austria is not really in the north, but in the center, but Sweden, Finland, and Austria. And then by far the most challenging, most important enlargement towards the east. 10 Central and Eastern European states joined in 2004 and 2007. And also, I think Malta and Cyprus were sort of thrown in at the same time. The last enlargement was Croatia in the year 2013, but in a way, this was unfinished business from the past, because in a way, Croatia missed the bus in 2004. It could also have easily been part of the Central European enlargement. And since 2013, no further enlargement, which is quite a long time in the historical perspective of the EU. Now we switch to the policy reforms. And on the left, you see some of the most important policy reforms that took place: customs union, single market, Schengen, CFSP, monetary union, banking union, Green Deal, and the last thing I put here is the new generation EU, the recovery fund from the I think this is not a complete list. There could be others there, but it gives you an idea on how the EU developed in terms of reforms. And what is interesting here is basically you had 2 factors that were in play. The one was sort of in a way the logical development of European integration. If you remove the internal barriers to trade, then soon you will have the idea that you should have a customs union and a common trade policy. And if you do this, then the idea will come, of course, why just trading goods? Why not services? Why not free movement of persons and capital? So you move towards the single market. And once you have the single market, do you still need the internal border controls? Do you get rid of them? This is Schengen. And then the crowning achievement of it all, you go to monetary union. So this is, I think, according to the theory, it's sort of functional theory of European integration that drives the process forward. But there is another factor there, is the response to crisis from very early on. The CFSP, Common Foreign and Security Policy, was basically a response to the Balkan Wars. The banking union and the European stability mechanisms were desperate efforts to contain the financial crisis. The Green Deal obviously is a response to the climate change that is getting more and more threatening. And the next generation EU was an effort to deal with the consequences, economic consequences and fallout of the pandemic. So these 2 elements there, sort of natural development of European integration, and at the same time also response to crisis. And on the other side, you see the institutional reforms, establishment of the European Council, direct elections, European Parliament, more majority voting, co-decision procedure for the European Parliament, and the High Representative, and then the President of the European Council, and the EES, and the kind of double majority voting in the Council. And here again, you have two factors, two main factors. One was the ambition to become more efficient. If you put all the heads of states and government into the same room, you can take decisions very quickly. These are the only people who can improvise. Everybody else has to ask for instructions. They can act very quickly. So from the beginning, it had an element of crisis management. Then the idea of having a permanent chairman of foreign policy, the High Representative, to have the permanent president of the European Council, these were also ideas, not necessarily absolutely the right ones to have a more effective system. More majority voting was very important and key to get actually the whole legislation agenda of the internal market to move forward. And the other element here is clearly an effort to have more democratic legitimacy, basically by empowering the European Parliament and making it more and more important. Direct elections, the co-decision procedure, more powers also from the Lisbon Treaty for the European Parliament. These were the two main points in this regard. Now, if you look at the dates of the major reforms and look at the dates of enlargement, there's no correlation, basically. It's very, very difficult to see any kind of relationship between the two. Because widening and deepening is frequently discussed as something, where is the priority, how should it go together? But my theory is it proceeds in parallel, but not in tandem. Basically, there is no master plan, there is no overarching concept. The EU develops basically by responding to the most urgent challenge of the moment. And essentially, and I'll explain this more clearly, then enlargement is driven by geopolitics and reforms are driven by opportunities and crises. There is a lot of discussion how these things are sort of should be linked or could be linked, but in the historical record, I would think that the relationship is really a rather thin one. Of course, enlargement has an impact on the reforms and the agenda. For instance, the UK coming in meant a big impetus to the single market. Margaret Thatcher had a big priority in pushing for the single market. Later on, she turned very skeptical on the EU, but this was a big historical contribution. And of course, the cohesion policy started out before the southern enlargement, but became only really important once Spain and Portugal were in. These were their contributions basically to the further development of the European Union. Now, basically, you see the reforms, there are two phases there. Until 2009, when the Lisbon Treaty entered into force, the emphasis was very much on treaty change, treaty reforms. You had intergovernmental conferences that took a long time. I was part of the Amsterdam Treaty reform, very tedious, very complicated negotiations, because basically the treaty has a double lock. On the one hand, you need to achieve unanimity among the government of all governments of the European Union, and then the result has to be ratified by all member states, mostly through big parliamentary majorities, in some cases through referenda. And that is quite a risky process. So the treaty then got the names basically from the cities where they were signed. And you have this whole series here from Maastricht to Amsterdam to Nice to Lisbon, and then stopped basically. Because at this point, it became too difficult. Enlargement, you had many more countries. Achieving unanimity among many more countries became very complex. You had more heterogeneous union with different views. The common ground became more fragile and more limited. You had the rise of radical right and EU-critical forces in many member states, which made referendums hugely risky and very, very dangerous. So basically, from that moment on, from the Lisbon Treaty on, the governments didn't like treaty reform anymore. It became a very, very unpopular proposition. Now, but of course, reform continued. And since that time, basically, it was crisis that drove the reform forward. And you see here, the financial crisis produced the European stability mechanism, the banking union, the fiscal compact, and other measures to strengthen the architecture of the monetary union. The migration crisis led to a certain strengthening of the Frontex organization, the border control institution of the EU, and also led to sort of the externalization of migration management. The Turkey deal, I think, is the most prominent example. The climate crisis, of course, the European Green Deal is a vast legislative process with more than 50 pieces that is now quite well advanced. And the pandemic, you had the recovery fund and the common vaccination program. And finally, the Russian threat, the Russian invasion of Ukraine led to massive funding for defense purposes, many programs to facilitate military aid, but also to strengthen cooperation and coordination on these issues within the EU. I would say within these 15 years of permanent crisis management, the EU has changed more than in the 15 years before. In spite of having, I think, 3 phases of treaty change before, fundamentally, the EU has changed much more. And how did it do so? Basically, if you can't change the treaty, you have to interpret it. And you interpret it very generously in some instances. Then you have had a lot of secondary legislation that you relied on. And in some cases, you had new financial instruments as a major force of reform. Or sometimes you had treaties, even the fiscal compact, outside the EU, the treaty structures, because there was no alternative. But you can do amazing things if you absolutely have to. And if you have unanimity, then the whole legislative construction can be adjusted as you basically need it. Now, this is a picture of Jean Monnet, one of the founding fathers of the European Union. And there's this very famous quote that is always quoted: Europe will be forged in crisis and will be the sum of solutions found in crisis. And there's a sort of simplified version, is that the EU always emerges strengthened from crisis. This is all over the place. Wherever there is crisis, you find Jean Monnet quoted. The interesting thing is he published this in his memoirs in 76. And I once, for a university course, I examined very carefully all the crises during his period to see whether that is actually true or not. And it's completely false. Jean Monnet was a bit of a drama queen, ultimately. And that's very sort of understandable if you think who he was, because he never was an elected politician. He never had sort of very important official political functions. He had a fantastic network and was an incredibly clever person, but he had to persuade politicians basically to follow his recommendations. And in order to do this, he created this narrative of crisis, basically, to force his ideas on these politicians, and did that very successfully. But there is another very important Commission president, Jacques Delors, who says, well, he doesn't think so. It's not true. Right? And I'm totally on Delors' side on this issue. So basically, in my view, there are 4 types of crises. There are crises that advance the European integration, and I would think the Balkan wars were stimulating for security policy. The financial crisis, I've spoken about the development of the monetary union. The pandemic, I've talked about this, also the Russian threat, and of course the climate crisis not only drove the integration process forward, but was really a transformational crisis and changes basically the way Europe operates in very important areas. Then there are crises that are hurting European integration. I would think the migration crisis was clearly a case in point. We had a certain strengthening in some areas of institutions, but overall you had massive divisions that continue until today, because on the one hand you have the division between the countries where these people, migrants, refugees arrive, and you have the countries where they actually go, and the interest of these two is extremely difficult to reconcile. And then you have countries that have, for historical reasons, a very hard line on migration. They basically don't want people to come in. I think Viktor Orban's Hungary is a case in point. And then there are countries that emphasize very much the tradition of the protection of refugees. So between these kind of north-south divisions and the values divisions, it's very, very difficult to come forward. Finally, I think a few weeks ago, a deal was struck on a new asylum law, but I have not met a single expert, basically, who believes that this will actually work. So I think this is going to continue to be an open wound and will produce a lot more tension and antagonisms in the EU. I also think the Gaza war is a case of point, of course, much less important, but it just has opened up divisions. It has driven member states against each other, and all this goodwill that we created by succeeding on Ukraine, basically to have a coherent front, fell apart very quickly in the case of Gaza. And then there are crises that are positive and negative. I would say Brexit was a huge loss. Important member states leaving, it's a huge blow to the prestige of the EU, also the capacity of the EU as a foreign policy actor. I think third largest economy. This was a devastating blow. At the same time, the UK was never really fully in. They were sort of semi-detached. They were a bit brake and obstacle on the development, the security policy, also on financial sort of burden sharing. So when they left, to some extent, certain things became possible that were impossible before. We would never have had the reconstruction fund with the UK in, and we would probably also have not as much progress on defense policy as we had. And then finally, there are crises that come and go, and they don't change very much. I think the energy crisis, there were any number of EU meetings, the European Council, etc. But ultimately, the successful management of the energy crisis of 2022 was really done by the member states. And ultimately, I don't think you've seen any genuine deepening as a consequence of that. And I would think that the failure of the constitutional treaty, which was rejected by voters in France and the Netherlands, was similar. Most of the substance was then transferred to the Lisbon Treaty. So but basically, it didn't change all that much. Now I'm moving to enlargement, and I very much like this phrase, the reluctant magnet. I have forgotten who coined it, but it says something that is quite beautiful, because the EU is very much a magnet. It's sort of many countries want to join it, but the EU is very much ambivalent about enlargement. I think normally the Commission is quite positive, not always. In the case of Austria, for instance, Jacques Delors didn't like that to happen. He invented the economic space, European economic space, in order to park us somewhere else. We had to wait until the legislation on the single market was completed. But generally, on most other cases, the EU, the Commission runs the business and is generally supportive. But member states are usually split. There are some who gain from it, others lose from it, potentially. They lose because their particular interests might not get the attention they got so far. They are losing because their voting weight is diluted with every new country. Somehow your votes are not as valuable as they were before. Sometimes countries are very much worried that basically the coherence of the union as a whole will suffer. So there are always big mixed feelings about it. The European Parliament is normally positive, but always links it with demands for more reforms, in particular, more powers for itself. Now, some states also usually have bad feelings about the incoming countries, and a huge issue in the enlargement process where now sort of bilateral grievances particular countries have. So Greece blocked Northern Macedonia for a long time. Bulgaria is blocking Macedonia now. Greece has now big problems with Albania. So these bilateral issues are always also a blocking element. Now, the big notion that is in a way dominating the debate, the internal bargaining on enlargement is the absorption capacity. And that goes back to the Copenhagen criteria for enlargement in 92, where the European Council defined the conditions for member states to join the European Union. These are, rule of law, respect for human rights, functioning market economy, this sort of thing. And there's also one condition that was added, a condition that the EU has to fulfill. And that is the EU Union's capacity to absorb new members while maintaining the momentum of European integration. This is also an important consideration in the general interests of both the Union and the candidate countries. The Commission later on didn't like the word absorption anymore. It uses now integration capacity, because absorption means basically you're sucked up and you disappear basically from the scene. And that's not what we want to convey. Basically, we say you join, but you're still there, right? So it's an unfortunate expression that the Commission now tries to avoid, but it's in the treaty and it's somehow still used a great deal. So you have, before every enlargement, a massive amount of internal bargaining between those who favor it, so some more skeptical, they have to reach an agreement. And much of this is really under the kind of label of absorption capacity. And it sounds very much like a sort of scientific term and objective criteria. Can you do this? Can you not do this? This must be something you can sort of nail down. But this is absolutely not the case. It's a deeply political concept. And people have used absorption capacities to block and delay countries that they don't like to join the European Union. They've used it to extract benefits for themselves. They've done it to protect particular issues, also push for political objectives that they favor. You have different types of motivations there. For instance, in the case of the UK, this was blocked by de Gaulle for a long time. And de Gaulle didn't admit that the problem was really the relationship between the UK and the US. He says the particular economic nature of the UK is incompatible with the economic way the EU is being run, right? When Portugal and Spain wanted to join, there was a big issue on the financing of agriculture. Particularly France was very worried about the agricultural competition. This was a big delaying factor. And in the end, I think Greece got extracted a lot of last-minute concessions before it agreed to have them join forward. So always you have this kind of mix of interests, and that has to be reconciled before enlargement can go forward. Now, I've said already at the beginning that the main reason why enlargement actually happens, if there's so much unhappiness about it, why does it still happen? And I think this was quite clearly geopolitically in practically all cases of enlargement. Before the fall of the Iron Curtain, this was the consolidation of Western Europe. There was also the US that was very strongly in favor, because basically it wanted to have a consolidated Europe, Western Europe on its side. So this was clearly the case for the northern enlargement, UK, Ireland, Denmark, and then in Greece, Spain, Portugal, also, I think, with a view of consolidating sort of new democracies after the transition from dictatorships. That was the second big idea at this point. Then after 89, the situation changed, and suddenly the neutrality was not any longer an issue, and Austria, Sweden, Finland, fairly affluent countries that were easy to absorb, were finally allowed, with some reluctance from the Commission side, to join the European Union. And by far the biggest sort of historic important enlargement was, of course, the joining of 10 Central and Eastern European states in 2004 and 2007, plus Cyprus and Malta. This was really, I think, if the EU is sort of wiped out tomorrow and collapses in the history books, the kind of successful transformation of the post-Soviet space will be seen as the biggest historical achievement. Because if you look at these countries, the minority problems, territorial issues that were open, without this common sort of discipline of the enlargement process, the common purpose of wanting to go to the EU, it's easily to imagine that this whole region could have run into similar experience as the Western Balkan states, wars, turmoil, refugee movements, etc. I think the enlargement process really kept it together and successful, and also hugely successful in economic terms. And I read somewhere that in 2019, in 1990, the per capita income of Ukraine and Poland was about the same. And now Poland has 4 times the per capita income of Ukraine. That shows that it really sort of achieved very, very big deal. Now, now the sad part of the story starts with the Western Balkans. These are all countries that are in the enlargement process. The promise for them to join has been made already in 2003, but they're very far still from joining, actually. There are 2 countries that are in the process of negotiation, that is Serbia and Montenegro. Recently talked to someone from Montenegro. He finally said, I'm so happy that finally Montenegro made it into the European Council. But he was talking about your prime minister, not about his country. And so the progress of these negotiations is extremely slow, excruciatingly slow. And altogether, there was a clear sort of loss of momentum here. When it was promised, this was still with as an after effect of the wars. We needed to stabilize the region, and the promise to join the EU was very important in this context. We also were aware that the Western Balkans would be an enclave within the EU, surrounded by EU countries on all sides, and it would seem extremely logical that it would move forward and also become part of the EU. But it became a great deal more stable. But that also reduced the geopolitical urgency, right? Because if it's very stable, you don't necessarily have to do something to bring it in. But you had governance deficits, very important ones. You have ethnocentric elites that are not necessarily very keen on joining the EU because that might undermine their power base. You have unresolved bilateral issues. You have one country, Kosovo, that is still not recognized as a state by 5 EU member states. The EU got distracted by one crisis after the other and did not engage sufficiently to compensate for the difficulties on the ground. So basically, the whole thing turned a little bit into sort of a double bluff. The EU sort of pretended to be still open to these countries, and these countries pretended to reform. But on the whole, you had massive frustration. People turned very cynical, and what happened is basically enlargement still happening, but it is happening on an individual basis. Masses of people, at least 2 million people from this region moved to the EU member states, because as Ivan Krastev has once said, it's much easier to change countries than to change your country. It was a logical response of many people that simply moved and left it behind. So altogether, that is a very sad story. But now, because of new political developments and geopolitics, there's a little bit, some people hope that we could regain the momentum. Now, Turkey is an even sadder story. Its membership applications goes back to 1987, before I think the majority of the people in this room were born. We finally opened accession talks in 2005. But in the EU, the attitudes were always deeply divided. Large parts of the public did not want this to happen because they felt Turkey was too big to absorb. It would be the biggest EU member state if it joined. Too different, basically. There's also the problem of, I said, enlargement is driven by geopolitics. The problem is Turkey became more powerful, developed its own geopolitical agenda, which is not easily reconciled with the EU geopolitical agenda. And you had unresolved conflicts with Cyprus and Greece. And you had then finally, at first, I think Erdogan used the enlargement process very constructively in order to forward, promote democratic reforms. But in 2013, somehow the logic changed. He became much more authoritarian, and that in the end gave a very convenient excuse for the EU to freeze the process. I don't think the process will be unfrozen. It's unlikely at the moment, but nobody wants to close the door. Basically, Erdogan wants to have his foot in the door, basically, and the EU cannot afford to alienate a hugely important partner in many respects, strategically, in terms of energy, in terms of Turkey is absolutely a key country, so the process is frozen, but it's still not terminated. And of course, I think eventually, I hope, probably the development of the customs union is the way out of this situation that could put the relationship on a better basis again. Now, the new geopolitical impetus now is, of course, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. The EU used to be very divided regarding these countries. There were some, particularly in the eastern part of the EU, that strongly favored the membership of these countries. But the majority was very skeptical, partly because they felt these countries were not prepared. Basically, they had structural issues. They were not developed sufficiently, but to a large extent also because they didn't want to alienate and provoke Russia by taking these countries in. And this logic changed quite suddenly after the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And suddenly the logic was, do we want gray areas between the EU and Russia? And the case was made that this promise of membership was a vital element of the support for Ukraine that would make it, allow it to survive. And it's, of course, what Ukraine wanted from the very beginning, because the revolutions in 2004 and 2014 were all driven by the desire of these countries to become part of the European mainstream. And the kind of discussions in the European Council were not easy, but ultimately I think the view prevailed that a negative signal to Ukraine would have been a huge gift to Vladimir Putin, and nobody wanted to do that. So basically the candidate status was decided in summer 2022. Last December, the decision was taken to start negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova, and with a certain delay. Also, the promise was that we could go ahead with Georgia. Now, this is now the kind of current map on enlargement. You have 10 countries in the waiting room. Turkey, as I said, is no longer realistic there. So we basically have two sets of countries. That's one is the Western Balkans. Only Kosovo doesn't have candidate status yet. And you have Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. So enlargement is back on the agenda, but also you have a huge debate again about the absorption capacity. There is some sort of debate on the time frame. Some people think we need a target date, and the President of the European Council has spoken about 2030 as the time when the EU needs to be prepared to have the first countries come in. The Commission reacted quite negatively about it, mostly I think because Mrs. von der Leyen and Charles Michel are not the closest friends, basically. But I've talked with lots of Commission officials who basically thought that the idea of the first countries coming in at 2030 is not unrealistic. It's essentially feasible and could be done, but they very much insist on a merit-based process depending on the fulfillment of the Copenhagen criteria. And they're also open, and that is a very important new development. Basically, there's greater openness on the gradual integration of these countries in certain parts of the internal market. Very complex legal issue, but it would facilitate things quite considerably. Now, the European Council in December 23 said that these are two parallel processes, two tracks, reform, enlargement. They have to proceed in parallel. and the Council is planning to have a roadmap for future work on enlargement and reforms by summer 2024. And the roadmap will probably not say anything whatsoever, because what is more relevant is, I guess, the Commission communication of last March, where the Commission said they will do policy reviews, but they will do these policy reviews only in the year early 2025. And they also say the multi-annual financial framework that will begin in 2028, and where the proposals have to be made by next summer, will have already to provide for the first enlargement. That at least is the idea. And that, I think, means probably that the real work, the real bargaining will probably only begin in the year 25, this will be an extremely complicated process. Now, what kind of reforms are we talking about in this context? I think when in terms of institutional reforms and governance, these are always the same things, basically. There's a clear preference by practically all member states that this should be done without treaty change, and based on provisions that are already in the treaty that allow reforms. And one case is majority voting. You can move towards majority voting pretty much on everything except fundamental institutional change and the enlargement decisions itself by using the so-called passerelle clauses in the treaty. You need unanimity in the European Council to decide on qualified majority voting on certain subjects. And one that is always discussed in this context is foreign policy. Taxes is another issue, certain aspects of social policy and other matters. The next one is the size of the Commission. I think most people think that there are far more commissioners than there are real jobs already today. In the treaty, there is already the idea of shrinking that to 2/3 of the member states on the basis of rotation, but this treaty provision has been suspended to resolve a problem with Ireland at one point. So this could be done relatively easily. Many member states think that we need more differentiation, flexibility in a much larger union. We have treaty provisions, but they're fairly heavy. And if you don't want to change the treaty, it's very difficult to see that you can go very far on that basis. And finally, we have a rule of law crisis over the last few years in two countries in particular, in Poland and in Hungary. And member states believe that we need the stronger instruments to address these issues in the future if we want to have enlargement successful. But again, you can do it partly by secondary legislation, like the kind of conditionality on access to funding that we already have. You can develop it further, but it's quite difficult to do. My feeling is, knowing a bit about the debate that is going on this issue, that you shouldn't have very high expectations. I think the problem is that resistance is enormous. There are a number of countries, particularly smaller countries, that are exposed politically, that are dead set against majority voting on foreign policy. There are some countries who think that voting on taxes is deeply not in their interest, basically. And they will not necessarily move because they want Georgia in the European Union, right? So I don't think the chances of moving forward in this direction, which I would personally very much favor, but they're not huge, because we had exactly the same debates in all the previous enlargements too, without very significant progress. And if there is sort of a geopolitical necessity to move forward on Ukraine, basically, because this is a question of keeping it as a functioning state. And I can't think that this is not happening because we have unanimity on taxes. It just doesn't seem plausible. I think the geopolitical impetus will be stronger. I very much hope we'll have progress on all these issues, but realistically, I don't think the chances are huge. When it comes to policies, you have basically two issues that are always discussed. One is agriculture and cohesion, and this is very much linked and almost focused on Ukraine, because all the other countries are basically peanuts in terms of policy adjustment. Nothing much has to happen to allow them in, but Ukraine is a big problem. There's a super competitive agriculture with very large farms. I think the average farm in Ukraine is about 1,000 hectares. Average farm in the EU is 16 hectares. So you have a huge disparity there. So if you apply the CAP as it is to Ukraine, you would basically give tens and hundreds of millions to these big, huge companies. And I don't think that is something that is justified and really necessary. But it's a big problem. The second problem is something that we already experience day by day. The Commission liberalized imports of agricultural goods into the EU. We have had a massive reaction by farmers in Poland, in Slovakia, and in other countries. And all these massive demonstrations by farmers in the last weeks were also partly triggered by concerns about cheap exports by the Ukraine. So ultimately, the only way to solve this is through very long transitional periods and by capping probably also the subsidies to very big agricultural companies. The second issue that is an important one for Portugal is, of course, the regional policy, cohesion policy. There are some people who say, well, being so large and being so poor, Ukraine will suck up all the regional funding, leaving basically nothing to anybody else. And this is a complete myth. This is just not true. And I'll show you this debate on financing, which is very much related to this. So again, I would think that the West Balkan states, Moldova and Georgia, being very small, this is not an issue one needs to talk about much. This is entirely possible to finance the accession without massive additional burdens. But it's different with Ukraine. It's a much larger country. It's a very poor country. I've read recently a study by the Brussels-based think tank Bruegel, and it came to the conclusion that if you assume that the Ukraine would already join now during the existing multi-annual financial framework, this would amount to a transfer of 136 billion euros over a 7-year period. This is 0.13% of the EU GDP, and the net payers would have to pay about 0.1% of their GDP per annum. That's not huge, right? That's basically something that should be manageable, particularly if you take into account that already now, without enlargement, the EU has to support Ukraine with massive funding. We just had a decision on 50 billion over the next 3-year period. So the added cost of membership is probably not all that dramatic. And everybody knows also the EU will have to make a big contribution to the reconstruction of Ukraine after the war. Essentially, you have an interesting situation. You have some countries, the Western Balkan countries in particular, where enlargement is not really so urgent. Because we've lived quite well for the last 20 years without much progress in this area. But where it's really easy, right? You have one country where it's potentially really urgent, important, but very difficult. And you have Moldova and Georgia sort of in between, because they would be easy to absorb, easy to integrate, but of course that momentum will be defined basically by Ukraine. It's very hard for me to imagine that these countries move forward without Ukraine moving forward. Now, really the most worrying thing for me is this basically, enlargement in a time of war. This is something that the EU has never done before. And there's a big tension between the enlargement process with the technocratic process that takes sustained commitment over a certain period of time, a lot of internal work. And I think it's amazing what the Ukraine has achieved over the last year or so in moving forward in various areas, but it's very, very difficult if you're bombed basically every day. And the second is war is something that really calls for a full mobilization, a total focus on surviving basically as a country. And between these two things, it's very hard to see how things will develop further. And of course, now, in the last few weeks, you get more and more speculation about Russia actually winning this, right? And a full victory of Russia would be, of course, the end of enlargement altogether, because it would be a huge blow to the prestige of the European Union. We are so heavily invested in this. We have made such promises that this would be totally devastating, apart from the fact of the risks of this, for the security of the remaining member states. It would also be the end of Moldova and Georgia's perspective, and possibly also to the end of their existence as independent states. If the war ends in some way, I don't de facto ceasefire, whatever, and Russia is still in control of a number of Ukrainian territories, then I think there can be a case made why enlargement can anyway go forward. I think that the EU has made one experience with Cyprus, where a certain part of the territory is not under the control of the government. I think everybody tells you, we've sworn to ourselves we will never do that again. But I can imagine there would be circumstances that anyway would force the EU to move ahead even in such circumstances. But it's obviously absolutely nothing that anybody can wish. Now, the final thing is, enlargement always was a sort of a proactive extension of influence. It was sort of an offensive policy, widening your influence. But now enlargement is part of a defensive strategy, basically, because I think the promise to Ukraine was also in our own interest to help Ukraine go through this war successfully. And security policy, which was never really a big thing in the previous enlargement, is suddenly sort of front and center. I think in previous enlargement, NATO accession usually preceded EU accession, and therefore this was never an issue for the EU. Now it's very uncertain whether NATO accession can happen at all, can move forward. And then, of course, the EU will be heavily exposed. So I think if NATO accession cannot happen, then at least the EU will probably require security guarantees that are quite solid and convincing. And it's very difficult to imagine that we can have the security guarantee without the US on board. So if Donald Trump is elected and he promised to solve the Ukraine crisis within one day, then we're in deep trouble, basically. If there's no perspective, no positive engagement of the US in trying to move this process to a successful conclusion, it will be extremely difficult to see how things can be rescued somehow. So I return to this earlier idea, widening and deepening and the interrelationship. I think it's still, enlargement is geopolitics, probably more than ever before. It's about security. The risks are much greater than they are before too. So the promise is very important. I don't think I'm 100% convinced that we did the right thing in giving this perspective of membership to these countries. We cannot take that back. We have to move forward. But the challenge is tremendous, and the risk of going things wrong is also better. In terms of reforms, you have a similar kind of situation. I think the stakes are higher. The era of crisis is not ending for the next few years. Reforms will be determined by the challenges that we'll see. Again, these things are not sort of linked. They're not parallel. They're parallel, but not in tandem. The real interrelationship is quite limited. The EU will also in the future focus on the challenge that is the most urgent at the time. And the idea of sort of an overarching great plan of moving forward is not going to happen. And what will be absolutely necessary if the EU goes through both challenges in terms of enlargement and reforms is we need a lot of leadership, a lot of cohesiveness and determination. And I think the record of the last 15 years of crisis is a rather encouraging one, because I think during all these 15 years, many predicted the EU would fall apart after Brexit in the financial crisis, and the EU turned out to be much more resilient and capable than many had expected. So the hope is that we will show this again also in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Professor Stefan Lehne for such an interesting, presentation and reflection on the current challenges that the European Union is facing, especially in regards to these particular issues of the enlargement and institutional reforms of the European Union, but also having this historical overview. I would like also to salute everybody, and particular the students in the back that are here. I would like to thank them and thank to the students nucleo of history, modern and contemporary history, but also to the students in political science that were mobilized also to be here, and I'm sure they have learned a lot. And so with no further ado, I would give the word to the audience. I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions. I do have some questions, but I will not abuse my privileges of sharing and moderating this this debate. So if anyone has questions, please, I think we can take 2 or 3 and then okay, we have several questions in the front, in the back. So I don't know, I think this first, let's just wait for the microphone, because as we are having a Zoom and streaming, we need to.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes, yes. Hi, I'm from the Embassy of Greece. I would like to thank you very much for your very interesting presentation, Professor. As you know, as you mentioned, many countries had difficulties with the enlargement procedure and bilateral issues to be dealt with. As you know, Greece had a problem with our neighboring country, North Macedonia, and we're very glad to have reached the agreement, the Prespa agreement in 2018, which entered into force. I would therefore like to ask you to use the right maps with the constitutional name of the country. Yes, that's the first remark I would like to make. And a second remark and a second question for you would be, it is very interesting, you mentioned enlargement, and all the countries present here, I see the ambassadors of everyone that I know from the EU. Everyone is here today. We've all benefited a lot from becoming members of the EU, and we wish the same to other countries wishing to join. However, how do you see this debate of enlargement in the context of the rise of the extreme right? And I'm saying this because one thing that you did not mention is a bit the cultural how do you say, element. And we have European elections coming in. How do you see this is playing with the mentality how people feel? Maybe should we go that far ahead, or maybe slow down a bit so as not to implode from the inside? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I am from the Luxembourg Embassy here in Lisbon. Professor, you talked about that enlargement has been driven mainly due to crisis response, lately at least. But at the beginning of the EU, there was also a vision, a more positive, I would say, narrative. So there was a vision to avoid war, of course, again, on the European continent, which unfortunately we now have. Now, my question is, do you see any chance to go back to a more positive narrative like in the beginning? Thank you.
Good morning, and for the introduction, I'm a former EU official and former colleague of Stefan. First of all, thank you, Stefan, for this very insightful presentation, and I'm happy to see that this is happening and that this discussion is happening here at the western end of Europe, so to speak, whereas we know that if the enlargement happens, it will be geographically at the other end of Europe. I have a host of questions, but I will start one which tags on to what the lady who first spoke said, the possibility of a further shift to the right in the European political spectrum. And a specific question related to the war in Ukraine. And as you have pointed out, Stefan, this is of course not just a threat to Ukraine, but a threat to the security of Europe. Do you foresee, anticipate possibility of a big debate coming up in Europe with a possible shift to the right about how to respond to the threat of Russia? Is it by confronting Russia, which is what we are doing currently by support we provide to Ukraine? Or is it by accommodating Russia in promoting some form of peace talks and putting pressure on Ukraine to accept some territorial losses in exchange for peace, which of course has its risks in itself. But the question to you, do you see that debate coming up? Thank you.
Just one more here and then we will have another.
Thank you very much for your very insightful presentation, Professor. I will start with a comment regarding the impact of the energy crisis. You placed it in the category of crisis, of events that come and go and leave no traces, major traces behind. I was wondering if you would accept a slightly different opinion from 2 points of view. Energy security is not just energy of supplies, it's also the protection and resilience of our critical energy infrastructure. And from this point of view, having worked, I'm a researcher here, but also an expert for the European Defence Agency, I've seen big changes in the past couple of years. And I see finally building a defense and energy related community in Europe, because let's not forget, energy and defense cannot be separated anymore, not since 2022. And we have witnessed the first deliberate attacks on our critical energy infrastructure, the Nord Stream explosions and the Baltic Connector incident last October. So what I see, there are, especially under the European Defence Fund, ongoing projects which are very rapidly evolving. And I see countries that used to be either passive or reluctant to participate in the past, but now they're speeding up also the cooperation, like the Consultation Forum for Sustainable Energy in the defense and security sector, because let's not forget that any disruptions in the civilian sector also impact the defense sector. The military doesn't have an energy infrastructure of its own. This is the positive. This is why I would put it, where you put the Brexit, for example, with positive and negative impact. This is the positive impact. The negative one is energy security as the security of supplies. Here, I'm not so optimistic because what I've seen since 2021 and 2022, there is still a big lack of solidarity among European Union member states. Some of them are still in the favor of importing Russian fossil fuels, some out of necessity, others out of, let's say, preference, so to put it. So I think here we are not so much of a union, not so much of an energy union. So this is why I would not say that the energy crisis comes and goes and doesn't leave any traces, if you agree with my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Is it working? Yes. Yes. Well, the first question is rise of radical right, the perspectives of enlargement. My institute, Carnegie, has just completed a study. We examined very carefully 14 of the biggest radical right parties, and we look at their positions on various foreign policy issues and their attitudes to the European Union. And what is interesting that I think of these 14 parties, the vast majority is very skeptical of enlargement. There's no question about it, but there are some exceptions. I think we have, for instance, PiS, the Polish party, largest party in the Polish parliament, is very favorable to the accession of Ukraine, obviously, I think for national interest. The party that's called AUR in Romania is very favorable to the accession of Moldova because it believes that Moldova is part of the Romanian territory, basically. And Hungary is very favorable to the accession of Serbia, because I think Mr. Orban thinks that he has a like-minded colleague in Belgrade. Mr. Vučić is getting along very well, but the prevailing attitude of most of these parties is quite negative. But you have to take into account that these parties have gained ground, but they are still in a minority. The interesting thing, the latest polling that I've seen for the European Parliament elections indicates that they have actually lost ground in the last 2 months. So the dynamic that everybody assumed that they would make huge gains doesn't look so plausible anymore. I think at the maximum, they will achieve about 25% of MEPs. And I think on the question of enlargement, there will still be sort of a coalition between the EPP, the Social Democrats, and the Liberal parties that has an easy qualified majority. So there will not be much problem in the European Parliament. In the Council, it's different. I think if Mr. Kickl would turn out in Austria to be Austrian Chancellor, which I don't hope and I don't think is very likely, he's totally against enlargement. And if you have 3 or 4, and you have, of course, Geert Wilders won the Dutch elections. You have elections upcoming in Belgium where Vlaams Blok will do very well. So if in the European Council you have a number of representatives of these parties, then I think that will have a negative impact on the enlargement prospects. But basically, that's still a minority. And if the mainstream parties stick together and pursue this objective together, then I think they can probably push back and still maintain the agenda. It was very interesting that Hungary tried to block support for Ukraine, but ultimately in the European Council in February, he had to go to have coffee or to the toilet, and the decision to support Ukraine went forward. So as long as these are just very few countries, I think the majority can usually win over. But if there are more and more of these parties, then we are clearly in trouble. The question is the more sort of possibility of reverting to a more positive agenda. Well, I would think basically, if you look at the origin of European integration, it was very much a crisis response, basically. It was the series of wars between Germany and France that were the fundamental reason, basically, why these countries had to be brought together. And the second thing that was also absolutely vital was the Soviet threat. I think European integration would never have happened without the common enemy in the East and the common protector in the West. So I think it always had this geopolitical context, and that has never changed until today. So I don't think there was never sort of a moment of pure harmony where everybody wants to come to bed. That it always had very solid reasons and roots in security policy and security considerations. Now, the third question, again, the shift to the right, will it affect support for Ukraine, and will this lead to a loss of coherence in confronting Russia? I think, again, the risk is there. Our study has shown very much that the a large majority of the countries in the ID group, which is the more radical group in the European Parliament, is very friendly to Russia, basically. There are 2 exceptions. One is the Estonian party Ekre, who is vehemently anti-Russian, and also the Dansk Volkspartei, but others are mostly very friendly to Russia. In the ECR group, it's different. I think the great majority there is very critical of Russia and basically supportive of the NATO agenda. But I think there is a risk, to be totally honest, that this cohesion that we have managed to achieve in the aftermath of the invasion could erode over time. I think particularly the risk is if Donald Trump comes back as US president, then I think there will be splits opening up within the EU. There will some countries that want to push back and see this as the moment for Europe to move forward, become more autonomous and independent. And there will be other countries who say that at all cost and all circumstances, we have to be on the right side with the US. And there you could have divisions that will undermine our support for the Ukraine. I think this is quite a generous risk, unfortunately. The fourth the question on, I would be with you altogether. I think altogether these categorizations I've made are illustrative. They are not based on science, right? And I would agree with you that the energy crisis was sort of a mixed bag, basically. I think in some areas progress was achieved, but overall, I would think there were also very splits and very big fights. A fight about funding. You remember these demands for a big European fund to finance energy imports. You remember the fight about the German bazooka, the 200 billion program for Germany that was very much resented in the South because they obviously were unable to mobilize similar forces. There was huge fights about delinking the energy prices from the electricity prices with very different approaches across the European Union. And basically what you saw is that the EU is still very, very divided on these issues. The national champions have different interests. And altogether, I couldn't see real significant progress towards deepening, but also because the member state action was quite successful actually in containing the problem to some extent by bringing in massive amounts of LNG and basically stabilizing the price situation after a while. But you're right, I think on some issues progress was achieved and will continue, but the splits and the divisions are still quite big.
Thank you so much. Another round of questions. Okay, we have Celso in the back and then also João here in front.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your intervention. And yeah, my name is Celso, and I'm a master's student in international relations and political science. And my question to you is regarding what you said, regarding the prospect of EU integration. It has had a stabilizing effect on the Western Balkans over the years. Now, as you said, the geopolitical impetus might accelerate the accession of Ukraine and possibly Moldova. How would you say that the EU should deal with expectations management regarding the Western Balkans nations that have been waiting for long? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now here, John.
Good morning, and thank you for this interesting and unique presentation. I have, for now, only two questions. What's your opinion on Ukraine's integration into the EU and its consequences? And my second question is, do you think the end of EU scenario is possible? I'm doing this. Do you think the end of the EU scenario is possible? I'm doing this second question because fascist parties are growing in Europe so fast, looks like a virus, and some of them think that EU integration is like to be part of an imperial, and they are estão a ser subjugados pela União Europeia. Estão a faltar a expressão. And that's all.
Obrigada. Thank you so much. Any more questions? Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm from the Embassy of Ireland, and I'd like to add to what my Greek colleague said, that Ireland is also a country that has hugely benefited from being a member of the European Union, not just in our economic transformation, but also at various other junctures in bringing peace to Northern Ireland, and also the solidarity of our EU partners during the Brexit negotiations. My question is that even though the unified response to the crisis in the Russian aggression against Ukraine is widely seen as a European success, I think it's also exposed that we have a bit of a problem in talking to the rest of the world, where I think many decision makers in the European institutions have been surprised that our narrative has not had as much cut through, and that Russian narratives have proved to find a bit more receptive audiences in a lot of parts of what I think we used to call the global south, and I don't think we found a good term for it yet. How do you think we should talk? Do you have ideas about how we should talk to like-minded countries in other parts of the world to maybe be more effective in talking about our view of the world, our view of this conflict, but also in a wider sense, what relations between EU member states and the rest of the world should be? Thank you.
Thank you. If I may pick up on this last question, one of the things that I noticed when you presented those four sort of characteristics or moments or crises that have hindered or advanced the integration, those four moments you put, and I agree with that, the migration crisis and now the Gaza crisis as the ones that hurt integration, as very bluntly have hurt the spirit of European integration, especially among the citizens. And I couldn't stop but thinking, was that also because it was one of the moments in which the European Union in itself went further away from its core principles and values of humanity and humanitarian aid and human rights and defense of promotion of democracy and so on. And so was it also, and picking up on this, it's probably, I also agree with you that the European Union is a very realistic construction and a response to crisis and a very practical and pragmatic thing, but it has lived also through a very important rhetoric of values and common principles. And I think is that a way that we could get closer to our citizens and maybe closer to other areas of the world in which the European Union image is a little bit not so easy or not so well seen? I don't know, it's a reflection. Thank you.
The first question was, how can we do better expectation management in the Western Balkans? Well, there are no more expectations in the Western Balkans. This is an area that I know very well because I've worked with Javier Solana on this. I have many friends in the region. I go there quite frequently. And the last 20 years produced a degree of cynicism that is unbelievable, basically. The people lost faith, essentially. They don't believe in it anymore. They will never say, we give it up, because that would be politically costly, but the faith, the confidence in a European future has shrunk dramatically because of delays, huge delays, because of promises that were not kept, because of bilateral blockages from countries, because of internal disputes. When EU officials now go to the Western Balkans, they say there is a real moment of opportunity because of the new dynamism of enlargement on Ukraine. You cannot be left behind. You have to use your chances. You have to move forward in reforms. Then you can make progress. And the EU has tried to do this, for instance, by giving Bosnia-Herzegovina the perspective of negotiations on accession, which is something that has never happened in the past. But my sense is that people in these countries don't really believe it. They have become so disappointed that something important has to happen to change the dynamic. And what could happen is if Montenegro, not the prime minister, but the country would actually move forward towards the EU. And if Albania does so too. These are the two countries that are best positioned to make progress, possibly joining around 2030. And that would change the dynamic, because then also Serbia would sort of understand this is actually moving, and Mr. Vučić would come under big pressure from the opposition, because if nothing is happening in this regard. So there is, I think, a lot of convincing to do, but I hope the EU will do so, and I hope Montenegro and Albania might be the countries that change the dynamic. Can I see a Ukrainian integration? Well, as I said, personally, I'd see it. I think to some extent, Ukraine is better positioned than most of the other candidate countries because it's a big country, basically, and it has a lot of institutional capacity. It's just, I sometimes sort of in in joke, because that's not a serious comment, but I think that a country that can defeat a big Russian army can also implement the legislation of the European Union. I think the capacity in this country is amazing. It is a very strong society. Civil society is very highly developed. There are fantastic people there, basically. So I think the chances are actually, and they would make a big contribution, positive contribution to the European Union. Can I envisage an EU falling apart? I can. Yeah, I don't think, you know, in history, nothing is forever, right? Things come and go. I think the EU has shown to be a lot more resilient, a lot stronger than many people had expected. There are many people, particularly in the US and the UK, who still think this is basically an experiment that should never really have happened. It's a mistake. And it will fall apart eventually because it's destined to fall apart. But it has shown to be much stronger than many people assumed. And I do believe that the internal market is based on very, very important interests. Nobody can really give it up. And if you want the internal market functioning, you have to have strong institutions. You have to have a strong legal base. You have to have lots of checks and balances. Basically, you can't, you know, the contradiction of the far right is that they want all the benefits of European integration, but they want to return to the sovereignty of the individual states. And that's complete nonsense. It simply cannot happen. So therefore, from that point of view, it would be in the interest, basically, it would be completely ridiculous and stupid to unravel what we have achieved over the last few decades. The next question, the Global South, the kind of Russian narrative, the EU narrative. I've recently written an article, and you find it on the Carnegie website, about the EU in the global battle of narratives. So, can I ask you to read it, please? Because there are lots of arguments there. Basically, I think the main argument is, you know, that unfortunately now in the EU, you have a number of people who say our foreign policy is overextended. We've lost influence. The EU is becoming weaker economically, demographically. We need to focus on the priorities, and the priorities is the European neighborhood. Let's do this and let's forget the rest. I think a surprising number of highly placed people argue like this. And this is a complete nonsense, because I think the only chance that we have in the future is to have a foreign policy that is more active and more globally oriented. And it doesn't mean that we have one template for the entire world, but we have to develop strategies for the important countries in the South, sort of tailor-made strategies for regions that are particularly important, like Central Asia, for instance, of Africa, which will be an absolutely key partner, and really focus on these issues and engage as much as we can. And I argue that the capacity to develop our diplomacy should be there, because we have probably the highest proportion of diplomats in the world, basically. And if we would use the capacity of the member states much more actively on behalf of the European foreign policy, can really make a difference and can get our message across much more effectively. I think that also answers your question, or does it?
Okay, thank you so much. I think we are almost on the schedule here. So I would now just ask you to join me and thank Professor Stefan Lehne for this brilliant intervention. And thank you so much for being here. And thank you also to the Austrian Embassy and to the representation of the European Commission in Portugal. It was great to have you and to work together. And so let's hope that we will keep doing it. Again, Professor Stefan Lehne, thank you so much.
Well,